Snow does not forgive a woman lying still, and Josiah Colm found one half buried at a rockslide, lips gone ash blue. Saving her would change his whole life and bring 60 riders to his door by winter, not for vengeance but to claim him. Every warning he'd heard about Apache country was the same. A white man's kindness out here reads as a trap or an insult, and either one gets you killed. He looked at the blue creeping up past her wrists and got down off his horse anyway. Winter of 1874, New Mexico Territory. Along the eastern slopes of the Black Range, where the Chihenne bands wintered in the canyons below Ojo Caliente. A man alone up there with nothing but a dead homestead behind him and no particular reason to still be breathing. What happened between him and a Chihenne woman named Winona over the following 10 months would end with 60 riders at his fence line, and it would not be the ending anybody watching from a distance would have guessed. If you've made it this far, you know these stories are worth the wait. Stay to the end, and if the West still means something to you, hit like and subscribe. We'll have another one waiting for you next week. Now here is how it started. The homestead sat crooked in a fold of land 11 miles north of Hillsboro, built mostly by Josiah Colm's own hands in the 2 years since he'd come west, with a wife who never saw a second winter through. Amelia had died of a fever that took hold in November and never let go, buried now under the one cottonwood on the property that gave any real shade. And after that, Josiah had simply kept working because he did not know what else a man was supposed to do with his hands. 40 head of cattle had dwindled to 26 through bad luck and worse weather. He mended his own fence, shod his own horse, and went weeks at a stretch, speaking to almost nobody. 34 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd done hard labor since boyhood, a beard he trimmed only when it got in the way of eating, eyes that had learned to watch a horizon the way other men watched a door. The nearest neighbor sat 6 miles off. The nearest town was a half-day's ride if the weather cooperated, which in December it rarely did. He had not always been a solitary man. Before Amelia, before the territory, he'd been a foreman's son in Missouri, with 3 brothers and a mother who kept a loud, crowded kitchen, and there had been a version of Josiah that laughed easily and didn't measure his words before they left his mouth. That man had come west, chasing land and a fresh start, found a wife and a wagon train out of Independence, built something with his own back and his own money, and watched a fever take all of it in 9 days. He kept Amelia's name out of every conversation in Hillsboro. He kept most things out of most conversations in Hillsboro. What he'd settled into wasn't peace so much as the absence of anyone left to interrupt the quiet. That December, word went around the county that a Chihenne hunting party had crossed south of their usual range chasing elk pushed low by an early hard freeze, and half of Hillsboro worked itself into a lather about raiding parties and stolen stock. Most of the noise coming from men who had never stood within a quarter mile of an actual Apache and intended to keep it that way. Josiah rode into town for flour and coffee and came home with 3 different versions of the same rumor, each bigger than the last, and thought mostly about the price of flour on the ride back. Fear that wasn't his own had a way of sliding off him without sticking. The storm came down out of the north 2 days later, with a suddenness old-timers in the territory would talk about for years afterward. Unseasonably mild that morning, mild enough that Josiah had ridden a wide loop-checking stock that had wandered toward the Rockslide country at the edge of his grazing land, and by early afternoon the sky had gone the color of a day-old bruise, the wind laying itself flat and hard against the ground the way it does before a true blizzard, not the ordinary kind. He turned Duke, his gelding, back toward the homestead with maybe 2 hours of daylight left, moving along the base of the ridge where a rockslide had come down some years back and left a jumble of boulders and downed pine that made for slow, careful going. That was where he saw her, a shape half buried in a drift against the leeward side of a boulder, dark hair frozen in a stiff sheet against dark cloth, one hand visible above the snow line, curled and still. His first read of it, the way a man's mind works fast and wrong in a crisis, was that it was an animal, a downed deer maybe. Then Duke shied and threw his head, and the shape resolved into what it actually was. He got down without deciding to. He'd think about that moment for years afterward, the fact that his body moved before his mind caught up with the danger of it, before every warning he'd absorbed since coming to this territory had a chance to argue him out of it. He knelt in the snow beside her, saw the beadwork on her sleeve, the moccasins packed with ice, a woman maybe 23 or 24 with a face gone the wrong color. Every story he'd ever heard about what happens to a white man who touches an Apache woman, without invitation, rose up in him. At once he put his hands on her anyway. She woke with a violence that surprised him, eyes snapping open, dark and unfocused with cold, her hand going for something at her belt before her body remembered it didn't have the strength to finish the motion. Josiah held both hands up open and didn't move closer. He kept them there a long moment, letting her look as long as she needed, saying nothing, because there wasn't a word in either language that was going to do more good than stillness. Her name, he'd learn over the following days, was Winona, and the blue in her lips left little time for deciding whether to trust a stranger. He unrolled the blanket tied behind his saddle, a plain wool trade blanket, nothing fine about it, and held it out toward her, rather than draping it over her, the way you'd offer a hand to a spooked horse rather than grab for the halter. She looked at the blanket. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not trust exactly, more a calculation resolving itself, and she let him settle it around her shoulders. She couldn't walk far on her own. He got her up behind him on Duke, her arms locked around his middle with the last of her strength, and the 2 miles back to the homestead took the better part of an hour with the wind trying to peel them both off the horse the whole way down. He got a fire going in the cabin's iron stove before anything else, packed snow into the kettle, laid her down near the heat wrapped in every blanket and coat he owned. Her core temperature had dropped further than he had the equipment or the knowledge to properly treat, and for the first several hours he simply kept the fire fed and her body as warm as he could make it, not knowing if she'd live through the night. She did. Past midnight, her shivering eased into something closer to ordinary sleep, and Josiah sat in the one chair he owned, watching the stove, not sleeping himself. She was awake by mid-morning, alert enough to take stock of the room, the way a person does who's woken up somewhere unfamiliar and dangerous. Door, window, the rifle over the mantel, the distance to each. He recognized the look. He'd worn it himself more than once in his life. He set a tin cup of coffee on the floor near her and stepped back to give her room, and she watched him retreat before she reached for it. She didn't speak that first full day beyond a handful of words that gave him nothing to work with, and he didn't press her. He went about his chores, fed the stock, split wood, cooked a plain supper of beans and salt pork, set a share of it near her without ceremony. She ate. That was the whole conversation the first day, an exchange of food and distance, and the careful watching two strangers do when neither one knows yet what the other intends. By the second day she was strong enough to sit up on her own, and Josiah began to see, past the fever and cold, to the woman underneath it. A directness in her eyes that didn't waver when he looked at her, a way of assessing everything in the room, the fire, the tools, the weather through the window, of a woman unaccustomed to being helpless and none too pleased about the position. When he tried a few mangled words of greeting he'd picked up from a trader years back, her mouth twitched in something almost, not quite, a smile. Her English came in fragments over the following days, more than he'd expected, picked up from a mission school she'd attended briefly as a girl before her family pulled her out of it. Enough that they built a rough bridge of words between them, filled in with gesture and patience. Her name was Winona. She'd been checking snares 2 ridges north when the storm came down faster than any storm she'd seen in her life, her horse spooking off at the first hard gust, and she'd lost the trail back to her family's winter camp somewhere in the whiteout, walking until her legs gave out near the rock slide. She laid out the ordeal the way a person describes a problem already solved. Matter of fact, no self-pity in it. Piece by piece. In the days that followed, Josiah learned she had a mother still living, a younger sister, and an uncle named Chato who'd taken on the responsibility of speaking for their family since her father died 3 years back in a rock fall, much like the one that had nearly killed her too. She laid it out plainly, and Josiah recognized in the flatness of it a grief old enough to have found its permanent shape, the same shape his own grief for Amelia had settled into. "Your family?" she asked on the third day, watching his face the way she watched everything, carefully missing nothing. He gave it to her plain. "A wife. Fever. 2 winters back." Winona went quiet a moment. "I am sorry." Something in the plainness of it landed harder than a more practiced sympathy would have. His own condolence about her father came out just as plain, and she answered with a single nod, and that was the whole exchange, and it was enough. The storm kept them both inside for the better part of 5 days, and in that time something began that neither one of them named. Winona showed him, without being asked, how to read the tracks outside the cabin door which animals had passed in the night, which direction the wind had been coming from by the pattern the snow had drifted against the fence posts. She corrected his pronunciation of Apache words with a rigor that gave no partial credit, repeating a sound until he had it exactly right. He handed her the English words she didn't have yet, and she picked them up faster than he could supply them. There were quiet stretches, hours at a time, where neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the stove ticking and the wind working at the walls, and Josiah noticed the quiet didn't feel like the isolation he'd grown used to. It felt like something shared. 2 years alone in that cabin had convinced him he preferred it that way. Some part of him now understood that it had been a lie he'd needed at the time. He caught himself watching small things about her the second evening. The exact economy of her movements when she banked the fire, no wasted motion in it, the way she tested the heat of the tin cup with the back of one knuckle before she trusted it against her palm. She caught him watching. She didn't look away first. On the 4th day he tended a cut on her forearm from her fall near the rockslide, a gash she'd bound herself in the dark with a strip torn from her own dress before the cold numbed the pain of it. She let him clean and rebind it, watching his hands the whole time, not the wound. When he finished, she looked at the work and gave a single nod. Good. Maybe her 4th word of English total, and he understood, the way he was starting to understand most things about her, that she didn't spend, words she didn't mean. That same afternoon, she drew a small shape in the ash by the stove with one finger, a rough outline of mountains, and pointed south, then pointed at herself, then swept her hand in a slow arc that took in the whole cabin, and, by extension, he didn't fully follow the meaning. He understood the gesture was a kind of accounting, a woman keeping track of a debt she intended to remember precisely, and he found himself wanting to know exactly what she'd written down about him in whatever ledger she was keeping in her head. That evening he showed her the worn book of essays that rode in his saddlebag, the one he'd read so many times. Whole passages came to him unbidden during long silences on the trail. She couldn't read the words, but she studied the pages the way she studied everything, turning them slowly, running one finger along a line of type, as if she could feel the shape of the meaning through her skin. He read a passage aloud, haltingly, translating as best he could into the handful of Apache words he had, something about a man's obligation to notice the world around him rather than merely pass through it. And she listened with her head tilted in that particular way that meant she was turning the idea over completely before she'd allow it a place in her own thinking. When he finished, she took the book gently from his hands and held it a moment as though weighing it, then gave it back and said a single word in Chihenne. He didn't yet know. One he'd learned much later meant something close to keep her. The nights were the hardest to fill and the easiest to remember afterward. Josiah slept on the floor by the stove those 5 days, giving her the one real bed the cabin had, though there were nights the wind was loud enough that neither of them slept much, regardless of where they lay. On the third night he woke past 2 in the morning to find her sitting upright by the stove's last coals, wide awake, watching the door the way a person watches a door when they've trained themselves for years never. He didn't ask what kept her wakeful. He simply fed the fire back up and she watched him do it, and eventually her shoulders came down from around her ears and she slept again before the coals had burned back to ash. He never mentioned it to her afterward, and she never brought it up either. But something had passed between them in that unremarked hour that outlasted every conversation they had in daylight. By the 5th day, the storm had blown itself out. The sky over the Black Range scoured to that hard blue that follows a big snow. Winona stood in the doorway a long while, looking south, toward where her family's winter camp would be, and Josiah understood without her saying it that she meant to go. He proposed riding her part way, warned her the trail would be bad. She considered this and nodded, and they rode double on Duke as far as the fork where the canyon opened toward Ojo Caliente. There she slid down and stood in the snow, testing her balance, finding it solid. She looked at him a long moment, the same assessing look she'd worn the whole time she'd been in his care, except now something else lay under it he didn't have a name for yet. "Thank you," she managed, "for the blanket, for the fire." He'd have done the same for anyone, he answered, though he had no idea if that was true, only that it felt like the right thing to say. "Maybe," she allowed, "maybe not for a stranger who does not know our ways." She studied him another moment. "You did not ask anything of me. Some men would have asked something. For the help." He hadn't been looking to get paid for pulling somebody out of the snow, and that earned him the almost smile again, the one from the first morning. I will remember that, a weight in how she put it that he couldn't place. Then she turned and walked south along the canyon floor, sure-footed and unhurried, and didn't look back. Josiah sat on Duke and watched her go until the trees took her, then rode home to a cabin that felt emptier than 2 years of solitude had ever managed to make it feel. He told himself that was the end of it. A woman he'd pulled from a storm, tended, and returned to her people, the way any decent man would have done for a stranger, regardless of where she came from. He went back to mending fence and feeding stock and riding the long loop around his grazing land, and if his eyes drifted south more often than they used to, he chalked it up to habit, nothing more. Word got around Hillsboro within the month, the way word always did in a county that small. A rancher's hand had seen Josiah riding double with an Apache woman near the fork by Ojo Caliente, and by the time the story passed through 4 mouths, it had grown considerably more scandal than the truth contained. Men at the mercantile went quiet when Josiah walked in, and started up again in lowered voices when he walked out. One man, a freighter named Pruitt with more opinion than sense, informed Josiah to his face that a man ought to leave well enough alone where Apaches were concerned, and got back a look that ended the conversation without a word spoken. He didn't much care what Pruitt thought. He cared, more than he wanted to admit to himself, what had become of a woman named Winona, somewhere south along the Ojo Caliente canyons. Spring came late that year, the thaw dragging through March into a wet gray April, and Josiah worked his herd back up toward 40 head through equal parts luck and stubbornness. He didn't see Winona again that season, though there were nights he found himself standing at his fence line looking south for no reason he could name, and mornings he caught himself listening for hoofbeats that never came. He kept it to himself, because there was no one left to share it with. It was late that same spring, near the end of April, when Winona rode up to his fence line alone, unannounced, sitting a paint mare with the same unhurried confidence she'd walked away with the previous winter. Josiah was mending a break in the corral rail when he saw her, and the jolt that went through him took him a second to recognize as gladness, because it had been so long since gladness had visited him. She'd come, he pieced together, because her mother wished to send thanks properly, in the way her people understood properly, not just the handful of words she'd managed on the trail in December. She'd brought dried meat and a woven basket her mother had made, delivering both with a formality that made clear this was no casual visit, but an obligation being discharged with care. He put coffee on. She stayed longer than the errand strictly required, and Josiah found himself talking more in that one afternoon than he had to another human being in the 2 years since Amelia died. Missouri, his brothers, the loud kitchen he'd grown up in, and how strange the quiet of his own cabin still felt some nights even after 2 years of it. Her sister came up too, 12 years old and stubborn, refusing to be taught anything by anyone except Winona herself, and so did Chato, in careful pieces, a man who weighed every decision the way a man weighs a stone before deciding whether to build on it. She came again 3 weeks later, and then again after that, each visit carrying some small errand as its stated purpose, though both of them had quietly stopped pretending the errand was the real reason somewhere around the 3rd visit. Josiah started riding the southern edge of his grazing land more than his cattle strictly required, and more than once found Winona already there, having ridden north on some equally thin pretext of her own. The 4th visit, she brought no errand at all, and didn't pretend to. She simply appeared at the fence line in the late morning, and when he came out to meet her, she was already dismounted, already crouched at the edge of his kitchen garden, examining a row of stunted onions with open disapproval. Wrong time. She nodded at the row. Too early. Ground still cold underneath, even when the top looks warm. She pulled one gently from the soil to show him the pale, thin root, then pressed it back in with 2 fingers, tamping the dirt with more care than the plant strictly deserved. His question about the right planting time got a straight answer, followed by 3 other corrections he hadn't asked for, and he found he didn't mind being set right nearly as much as he'd have expected. Their courtship, if that's what it was, moved at the pace the land and the customs around them allowed, which was not fast. They sat at a careful distance on the flat rock above the creek, marking the unofficial edge between his grazing and her people's hunting ground, and talked, and sometimes didn't talk, and the not talking carried none of the old loneliness Josiah's silences used to carry. She taught him more Apache, correcting him with the same rigor as before. He carved her a checkerboard from a scrap of cottonwood and taught her the game, and she beat him more often than pride strictly allowed him to enjoy. One evening in early June, she brought her sister along, a wiry, watchful 12-year-old named S.A., who spent the first hour sizing Josiah up from behind Winona's shoulder before deciding, apparently, that he was safe enough to be openly curious about. S.A. wanted to know why his hair curled at the ends when it got wet, and whether he could really rope a running steer, a skill she found difficult to credit in a man who moved as slowly as he did around the cook fire. He demonstrated with a coil of rope and a fence post, and missed twice before he caught it clean, and Tessie laughed so hard she had to sit down, and Winona watched the 2 of them with an expression Josiah hadn't seen on her before, something unguarded. There were dozens of afternoons that summer that blurred into a single long season, in Josiah's memory, afterward, indistinguishable from each other in the particulars, but unmistakable in the shape they made together. Winona teaching him to gauge a storm 3 hours out by the behavior of the cattle rather than the sky, the way the herd bunched and faced a certain direction before the wind itself had shifted. Josiah teaching her to read brand marks and bills of sale, the peculiar paper logic of a country that required a man to prove ownership of an animal that had never once asked to be owned. She found this enormously funny, the idea that a piece of paper could out-argue a rope and a fire, and told them so more than once, and he found he didn't have a good answer for her. There was an afternoon in July when a rattlesnake came up through the woodpile while Josiah was splitting kindling, and Winona had it dead with a single thrown hatchet before he'd even located the sound, an economy of motion that left him standing there with his own axe forgotten in his hand. She skinned it without ceremony, offered him half the meat that evening, and watched with open amusement while he worked up the nerve to eat it. There was another afternoon later that same month when a wheel came off his supply wagon 2 miles from the homestead, and she helped him wrestle it back onto the axle in the beating heat, her hands as sure with iron and wood as they were with a blade, neither of them speaking more than was needed to coordinate the lift. And Josiah found something in the wordless cooperation of it that felt more intimate than an hour of conversation would have. By August, the visits had a rhythm to them that both households had quietly absorbed without either family formally acknowledging it. Josiah kept a second tin cup on the shelf that he thought of privately as hers. Winona's mother began sending a little more dried meat than the household strictly needed, an allowance built into her calculations for a guest who wasn't quite a guest anymore. Chato's silence on the matter had become, by Winona's reading of it, a form of patience rather than disapproval, though she was careful to remind Josiah that her uncle's patience and his blessing were not yet the same thing. He began that same August to notice how much of his own vocabulary had shifted without his particularly trying. He caught himself thinking in the seasonal terms she used rather than the calendar months he'd grown up with, measuring time by when the deer moved down from the high country rather than by a date on a page. He found himself listening for weather in the behavior of birds the way she did, and more than once caught a change in the wind a full hour before it reached the homestead, a skill that would have seemed like superstition to him 2 years earlier and now felt like simple attention. The kind of attention he'd let atrophy in the flat gray years after Amelia died. He mentioned this to Winona once, clumsily trying to explain what he meant without quite having the words for it in either language, and she told him that this was, in her people's understanding, the entire purpose of two people building a life together, not that one gave up their own eyes to see through the other's, but that both ended up seeing more than either could have managed alone. There was an evening deep in August when a summer storm caught them both at the creek, rock far from either home, and they waited it out together beneath the meager cover of a cottonwood, close enough that Josiah could feel the warmth coming off her arm in the cold rain, neither of them moving to close the last of the distance between them. Both of them entirely aware of how little distance remained. When the rain broke, she touched 2 fingers briefly to the back of his hand, the first deliberate contact either of them had allowed themselves in 8 months of careful proximity, and then withdrew them, and neither of them mentioned it afterward, though Josiah carried the memory of it through the following weeks like a coal banked and covered. Warm at the center of him, even on the coldest mornings, he learned, in pieces over that spring and summer, what her life looked like beyond what she'd shared with him in the cabin. Her band wintered in the canyons near Ojo Caliente and moved with the season into higher country through the warm months, following game and the land's own schedule of ripening. Her mother, a quiet woman named Claw, kept a careful household and had a reputation for the finest woven blankets in the band. Chato had earned his standing the hard way through years of sound judgment rather than any single dramatic act, and the band listened when he spoke. Winona herself carried a reputation, freely admitted without much modesty, for being the surest tracker of her generation, better than most of the men her age, a fact Chato regarded, with pride and occasional exasperation in roughly equal measure. By midsummer, Chato knew about the visits. Word travels in a small band the same way it travels in a small town, and Winona had never tried to hide where she rode. His silence on the matter stretched long enough to be its own kind of statement, Winona explained later, since Chato wasn't a man who withheld an opinion out of tact. When he finally raised it with her, the question was what she intended, not a demand that she stop. She recounted the conversation one evening at the creek, the light going gold and long across the water. Her answer to her uncle had been that she didn't know yet, that she was finding out what Chato expected to find. Josiah wanted to know. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave everything. Her uncle expected to find a man kind when it cost him nothing, and wanted to see if that kindness held when it cost him something. A fair test in her judgment. She'd have asked the same of anyone. Josiah thought about Pruitt at the mercantile, the lowered voices, and understood without her needing to explain further exactly what kind of cost she meant. Midsummer brought a second kind of testing neither of them had planned for. Winona's mother, Cla, requested a meeting with the man her daughter kept riding out to sea, and it happened on neutral ground, a grove of cottonwoods halfway between the homestead and the winter camp's summer range. Cla stayed nearly silent through the better part of an hour, watching Josiah with an attentiveness that unsettled him more than open hostility would have. Near the end came the one real question, whether he intended to make Winona choose between her people and his. His answer was that he didn't see why anyone should have to make that choice, that he intended to learn her people's ways rather than ask her to abandon them. Cla studied him a moment longer, then turned to Winona and said something in Chihenne that made her daughter's mouth twitch toward that same almost smile. Through Winona's careful translation, the verdict came back plain. She would wait and watch before deciding anything, same as her brother. The test proper came near the end of that summer when a small group of men out of Hillsboro, Pruitt among them, rode out to Josiah's homestead with the loose, ugly courage of men who'd been drinking before they decided to be brave. They'd heard by then what half the county had heard and came to voice what they thought. A man owed his own kind, though none of them put it in words that decent, most of it delivered in the shape of insult and threat instead. Josiah stood on his own porch and ordered them off his land. When Pruitt made a move like he intended to press the matter, Josiah's hand went to the rifle propped by the door, not raised, just resting there, a fact stated rather than a threat made. The men left. Josiah kept the visit from Winona for 2 weeks until a trader passing through gave her a garbled version of it, and she confronted him about the silence angrier than she'd been at the men themselves. A man didn't have to carry everything alone, she informed him flatly, standing in his doorway with her arms crossed. That wasn't how it was done where she came from. A man who'd tried to carry everything by himself was a man who'd forgotten he had people. He admitted, plainly enough, he'd been alone long enough to forget that sometimes. She studied him with that same careful, unhurried attention. She gave everything and made her position clear. She'd remind him as often as it took. By autumn, Chato requested a direct meeting, and Josiah rode south into the canyon country for the first time since the day he'd carried Winona out of a blizzard, this time as an invited guest rather than a man delivering a debt. Chato was a broad, deliberate man in his 50s, a stillness about him that reminded Josiah of certain older ranchers back in Missouri, men whose opinion carried weight because they'd earned the habit of being right. Plain questions got plain answers, expected in return, about the herd, the land, Josiah's intentions, what he understood of the responsibilities a man took on joining himself to a woman whose people weren't his own. Josiah gave what he had as honestly as he knew how, including the parts uncomfortable to admit, that he didn't fully understand Chihenne law, that he expected to make mistakes learning it, that he intended to keep learning anyway. Chato listened without much expression, and at the end allowed only that he'd think on what he'd heard. This itself was a form of respect, Winona explained later, since her uncle didn't waste consideration on men he'd already decided against. Autumn brought its own small trials. Josiah spent 3 days that October helping Chato and 2 of the band's younger men track a mountain lion that had been taking calves from a neighboring rancher's herd, work that had nothing to do with courtship and everything to do with a man proving himself useful in ways that didn't require an audience. He froze half to death on the 3rd night waiting out the animal in a rock blind, and kept quiet about it afterward. It was Tesse, not Winona, who let slip weeks later that Chato had mentioned the cold nights more than once with something that in a less careful man would have been called approval. The lion hunt taught Josiah more about Chato than 3 months of careful courtship had managed. He watched the older man work a game trail the way Winona worked one, patient past the point where most men would have given up and gone home, reading signy and bent grass and disturbed gravel that Josiah would have walked straight past without a second glance. Chato spoke little on the trail, but what he said carried the same economy his niece's words carried, nothing wasted, nothing repeated, that didn't need repeating. On the second evening, crouched together over a small, smokeless fire, built low enough not to carry across the canyon, Chato asked him, without preamble, whether his mother and father had approved of the marriage that had brought Amelia into his life. Josiah admitted they'd both been gone by then, that the decision had been his alone to make, for better or worse. Chato turned this over for a long while before he spoke again, this time about his own dead brother, Winona's father, a hunter respected through 3 bands for a steadiness under pressure that had, in the end, not been enough to save him from a rockfall that came without warning on an ordinary afternoon. Neither man offered the other comfort. Exactly what passed between them instead was closer to recognition, 2 men who understood precisely what the other had buried and what it had cost to keep functioning afterward. They took the lion on the 4th morning, a clean shot from a position Chato had chosen the night before with what Josiah now understood was the same unhurried certainty the man brought to every decision. Riding back toward the winter camp with the animal lashed behind them, Chato remarked, almost as an aside, that a man who could sit still through 3 freezing nights without complaint for another family's cattle was a man worth watching a while longer. It was the closest thing to a compliment Josiah had yet received from him, and he turned it over in his mind, the whole ride home, the way a man turns over a coin whose value he isn't yet sure of, but suspects is considerable. The understanding that grew between Josiah and Winona through that year never crossed the line either of them had quietly agreed to keep, a line drawn well short of anything, beyond held hands and long looks across a fire and the kind of waiting both of them seemed to find, if not easy, at least worth doing right. There was a formality to the courtship Josiah came to respect more the longer it went on, an old caution in himself giving way slowly to something that felt, for the first time in years, like a future whose shape he could actually see. Snow came early that second winter, the first hard freeze arriving in late October with a bite that told the whole county to expect a long, difficult season. On a gray afternoon in early November, not quite a year since he'd found Winona half buried near the Rockslide, Josiah heard what he first took for thunder rolling up out of the south, then understood as the sound resolved into its particular rhythm was hoofbeats, a great many of them moving toward his homestead with purpose. He stood at his fence line and watched them come, riders spilling out of the tree line where the canyon opened onto his grazing land. More riders than he'd ever seen gathered outside of a cattle drive, men and women both, dressed for travel and cold weather, moving with the unhurried certainty of people who decided something together and weren't in the habit of second-guessing a decision once made. He counted past 60 before he stopped counting, and even that wasn't the whole of them. His first thought, old fear surfacing out of habit before his better judgment caught up, was that this was retribution. Some line crossed after all, the county's ugliest predictions come due on his own doorstep. He looked for Winona among the riders and didn't immediately see her, and for one long cold moment he thought the worst thing a man in his position could think. Then the riders parted, and Chato came forward at their head, and behind him, unhurried, sitting her paint mirror with the same calm she carried into every room she'd ever entered, was Winona, dressed, not for travel, but for something more formal, her hair worked with silver and turquoise, a woven shawl over her shoulders he'd never seen before. Chato drew rein a dozen feet from the fence and studied Josiah a long moment. "You have been tested for a year." His English came careful and unhurried. "Since the day you carried my niece out of the snow and asked for nothing. We do not decide a man's worth from one act of kindness. We decide it from what a man does after, when kindness has had time to become inconvenient." He looked toward the homestead, the mended fence, the modest cabin, the 26 head of cattle grown back to near 40. You did not hide her. You did not hide from the men who came to your porch with ugly words. You stayed steady the whole year, In the small things and the large ones, both my band has watched this. We do not act on rumor. We act on what we have seen with our own eyes. Josiah found he couldn't immediately speak. Winona watched him with an expression he'd come to know well over the past year, patient, exacting, and under it something warmer than either of those words captured. Chato went on. It hadn't come to take anything from him, and hadn't come to take his niece back from wherever her own heart had settled. A debt this large wasn't repaid with a basket of dried meat and a spring visit. It was repaid properly, before witnesses, the way the Chihenne had always done it. They had come to claim him, not as a captive, as kin. If he would have them as he'd had his niece's friendship this year, he would be Chihenne to them from this day forward, welcomed the way the band welcomed a man who'd proven, over the true test of time, rather than the false test of a single storm, that his word meant what he said it meant. Winona rode forward then, drawing rein beside her uncle, looking at Josiah with the same directness she'd worn the first morning she woke in his cabin, appraising, unflinching, and now, unmistakably something more. She hadn't come back that first spring, only to thank him for a blanket. She made plain now. She'd come back to see if the man who'd asked for nothing in a blizzard was the same man on an ordinary Tuesday, mending a fence with no one watching. He was. Her people didn't give their claim lightly. They'd watched a year. They weren't often wrong when they'd watched a year. Josiah looked at the assembled riders, at Chato's steady face, at Winona sitting her mare with the shawl catching the gray afternoon light, and understood he was being offered something larger than he'd known to hope for when he got down off his horse in a blizzard 11 months before. Not because he'd calculated the cost of a woman's life against his own safety, but because he hadn't calculated at all. He didn't have the words for what it meant to him, not in their language or his own. He'd learn. He already knew he wanted to. Chato studied him a moment longer, then gave a single economical nod, the same one Winona gave when a piece of work met her standard. The correct answer, apparently. The men who studied for the test before they knew it was a test rarely gave the true one. The gathering that followed lasted the better part of 2 days, held partly on Josiah's land and partly in a clearing along the creek, marking the old boundary between his grazing and the band's hunting ground, a boundary both sides now treated as more ceremonial than real. Claw pressed a woven blanket into Josiah's hands, work she'd done herself through the autumn once Chato's decision had become clear enough to prepare for. Essay, no longer shy of him, spent the better part of an afternoon teaching him a hand game with more patience for his mistakes than he'd expected from a 12-year-old who beat him at it soundly every single round. Chato accepted in turn a rifle Josiah had kept oiled and unused since a trade years back, offered not as payment, but as the kind of gift that says a man understands the difference between a transaction and a relationship. There was no priest, no church, nothing that would have satisfied a circuit judge in Hillsborough, and Josiah understood by then that had never been the point. What mattered was the year that had passed between a stranger's kindness in a blizzard and 60 riders coming to say that kindness had proven itself real over every ordinary day in between. Winona stood beside him at the center of the gathering as Chato spoke words in Chihenne. Josiah couldn't fully follow, but felt the weight of anyway, the particular gravity of language built for exactly this purpose, carried down through more winters than either of them would ever know the count of. 2 elder women from the band brought gifts to the fire that evening, a beaded pouch, a length of dyed rawhide, a pair of eagle feathers taken from the canyon rim the previous spring, and set them at Winona's feet rather than Josiah's, a distinction he asked about later and was told mattered more than he understood, yet the gifts honored the woman whose judgment the whole band was now standing behind, not merely the man she'd chosen. Winona kept the eagle feathers threaded into her hair for the rest of that gathering, and Josiah thought, watching her across the fire, that he had never in his life seen anyone look more entirely herself. S.A. found him alone at the edge of the firelight, sometime past midnight, unable to sleep, still turning the whole enormous day over in his mind. She sat beside him without asking permission, in the manner of a sister rather than a guest, and told him plainly that she'd known before anyone, before even Winona had said a word of it aloud, because her sister had started mentioning the crooked homestead north of Hillsboro in a tone she never used for ordinary errands. She told him he'd better learn to make the acorn stew properly before winter, because Winona's own attempts at it had always come out too bitter, a fact Winona would deny if asked, and Tessé would insist on regardless. He promised to learn. She seemed satisfied with this and sat with him a while longer in the firelight without saying much else, and Josiah understood he had gained not only a wife, but a small, sharp-tongued sentinel who intended to keep him honest for the rest of both their lives. Chato found him too later still, when the fire had burned to coals and most of the camp had gone to sleep. He didn't sit. He stood a while, looking into what remained of the flames, and then told Josiah, in the plainest English he'd used all year, that the test had never really been about the blizzard at all, that any man might do a brave thing once in a life and never again. What the band had watched for through the whole ordinary year was whether Josiah could be trusted with something more difficult than a single act of courage, the daily, unglamorous work of keeping a promise nobody was forcing him to keep. He said he believed Josiah could. He said his sister, Winona's mother, believed it too, and that his own brother, dead 3 years now, would have believed it before either of them, because he'd always had a soft judgment for men who did their work without needing to be seen doing it. Then he clasped Josiah's forearm once, briefly, in a gesture that carried more weight than the whole ceremony that had preceded it, and walked back toward his own fire without waiting for a response. The following spring, Josiah's homestead looked different than it had for the 2 lonely years before it. A second structure went up along the creek, adobe and timber both, built with hands from both sides of a line that had once seemed unbridgeable and now barely registered as a line at all. Claw visited through the warm months. Essay rode north whenever she pleased, treating the mended fence as a formality rather than a boundary. Chato came twice a season to talk cattle and territory politics and the things a man his age found worth discussing with a nephew he'd decided, in his own unhurried way, to claim as fully as any nephew born to the band. Hillsboro never fully came around. Men crossed the street rather than speak to Josiah when he rode into town, and men said things behind his back they lacked the nerve to say to his face, after the day Pruitt's crew left his porch without the fight they'd come looking for. Josiah minded this less with each passing season. He'd spent 2 years after Amelia's death, believing solitude was simply the shape his life had settled into, a fact to be endured rather than a wound that might close. He understood now he'd mistaken numbness for peace, and that the real thing, when it finally arrived, looked like a woman correcting his Apache with rigorous patience at a creek's edge, a sister who beat him at a hand game every single round, an uncle who trusted him with the weight of a rifle and the harder weight of a family's name. Winona kept, all her life, the plain wool blanket he'd first held out to her in the snow, worn soft with years of use, folded at the foot of the bed they shared in the adobe house by the creek. She never fully explained why that particular blanket mattered more to her than the finer ones her mother wove afterward. And Josiah came over the years to understand that some things didn't need explaining, only keeping. There were harder seasons ahead of them than that first winter droughts that thinned the herd again, a fever that swept through the band's camp 2 winters later, and took 2 of the elders Josiah had come to respect, a stretch of years when the territory's politics turned uglier for the Chihenne than either Josiah or Winona had reason to expect. They weathered what came the way they'd weathered the first storm, together and without much ceremony about it. Winona reading the land the way she always had, Josiah learning to read it a little better each year at her side. Chato lived long enough to see 3 of their children grow past the age he'd once judged Josiah's patience by, and he never once let Josiah forget how close the whole thing had come to going differently, though the way he said it, in later years, always carried more warmth than warning. Their eldest, a daughter they named for Josiah's mother in English and for Winona's grandmother in Chihenne, grew up moving between the adobe house and the winter camp with the same unbothered ease Tessé had shown crossing the fence line years before. Fluent in both worlds in a way neither of her parents had managed until adulthood forced the education on them. She was tracking deer sign with her mother by age 8 and reading Josiah's worn book of essays by age 10, and Josiah found there was a particular satisfaction in watching her move between the two inheritances without treating either one as the lesser, the way the wider world outside the canyon country so often insisted she should. Hillsboro's hostility softened by degrees over the years that neither Josiah nor Winona bothered tracking closely, less because attitudes changed outright than because the ranch kept producing good cattle and Josiah kept paying his debts on time. And a frontier economy has a way of eroding prejudice faster than any sermon does. Pruitt himself was gone from the county within 5 years, run off by a bad debt of his own making, and the men who replaced him at the mercantile counter had less appetite for the old arguments. Josiah never sought anyone's approval on the matter. He'd stopped needing it the day 60 riders crossed his fence line to tell him what they'd already decided, and everything Hillsboro thought after that struck him as considerably less important than it might once have. Some men spend a lifetime waiting for a single moment to prove who they are. A fight, a fire, a flood, some crisis loud enough to be seen. Josiah Colm had already had his moment alone on a mountainside in a blizzard, and had passed without a witness in the world beyond a half-frozen woman, too far gone to remember it clearly. What earned him a family in the end wasn't that single moment at all. It was the whole ordinary year that came after it. Every unwatched Tuesday he showed up the same as he had on the day that mattered, until a band of people who didn't give their trust lightly rode 60 strong across his own fence line to tell him they'd seen it, every day of it, and found it true. If this story is the kind that stays with you, you know what to do. Hit that like button, leave a word in the comments about which part landed hardest, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll be here next week with another story the West tried hard to forget, and we'll be glad to have you with us. Until then, ride safe, and remember that the biggest changes in a life rarely arrive with any warning at all. They just arrive. The way a stranger arrives out of a storm, and it's what you do on the ordinary days after that decides how the story ends.